Alright, you're looking for a new MMO to play. I know the feeling, I've had the same itch all too many times. I'm an MMO lover myself, and I've spent the last 20 years playing every good and bad MMO that I can get my hands on. In this video, I'm going to do my best to give you all the information you need in order to decide if Final Fantasy XIV is the right MMO for you. This is not a sponsored video, so I'm covering the good and the bad. In this video, we'll talk about the following topics that can make or break the MMO experience for any player: solo content, group content, PvP, combat, customization, population health, and monetization. First, let's talk about the solo content. Are you able to solo your way through this game without a group of friends or without being in a guild? Is the solo content fun? Is it exciting? This is an important topic for any MMO. First, yes, you can play this game solo to your heart's content. Final Fantasy XIV's main story quest does require you to do various types of group content, but Final Fantasy also offers what it calls its duty support system. This basically fills your party with NPCs if you wanted to, so that you can run group content without the stress of learning how to play the game with other real people. Now, I'm not one to judge. If playing the game with NPCs is how you want to play, power to you. But I will say that Final Fantasy XIV has the nicest community out of any MMO I've played. Yeah, there's still some bad apples out there, but they're much fewer and farther between, as the developer is fairly active in punishing people when they're being generally awful human beings. But let's get back to the story. There's so much to say about the main story quest in any MMO. In some MMOs, the main story quest is the thing you spam click your way through to get to the end game. In most MMOs, players couldn't tell you any of the details of what the main story was because typically MMO stories are awful or awfully delivered. This is where Final Fantasy really stands apart from the other MMOs. The main story has so much effort put into it, and it's so well written, and most importantly, it's so well delivered. As I mentioned, I'd cover the good and the bad, and the bad part of the Final Fantasy story is that it's weighed down with a lot, and I do mean a lot of dialogue boxes. This is especially tough for players to get through in the early game before it became normal to have nearly every ounce of dialogue voice acted much later in the game. This is a big part of why people say the game gets better the longer you play it, because it literally is getting better as you play from one expansion to the next. You can see the developers learning what worked and what didn't as they moved from expansion to expansion, culminating in one of the best received expansions of all time when they dropped Endwalker. During the Endwalker expansion, Final Fantasy XIV even saw itself briefly eclipse World of Warcraft to become the most popular MMORPG in the world. And now 2024 brings with it the Dawn Trail expansion, which is adding to the game 3 new classes, but we'll dive more into that in a moment. Another thing Final Fantasy XIV does incredibly well is they tie the dungeons and trials of the game seamlessly into the story with voice acted cutscenes that have left me on the edge of my seat. These cutscenes deliver the climax of the moment so much better than talking to an NPC can. In other MMOs, you don't get a cutscene at the end. You go talk to a guy with an exclamation point over his head and turn in a quest, and it just doesn't hit the same. A lot of you are the type of player to skip through quest dialogue without reading it, and let's be honest, most of us have been that player in one MMO or another. That's because in a lot of MMOs, the quest dialogue was very low effort and not interesting enough to be worth reading. So for many players, this is the hardest habit to break while playing Final Fantasy XIV. There's a saying that holds especially true with Final Fantasy XIV, and that is, it's about the journey, not the destination. A lot of MMOs have trained us that we have to sprint to max level, that everything up to that point is a waste of our time because the gear we are farming is outdated, the quest rewards are old. But with Final Fantasy XIV, if you skip through the story, it's like watching Breaking Bad and just skipping random episodes so that you can get to the last episode sooner. Sure, you're gonna get there sooner, and yeah, you'll mostly enjoy it, but you're just robbing yourself of the chance to get to really marinate in that story some more. And worst of all, you're just gonna run out of things to do faster. With Final Fantasy XIV, I very much recommend you slow down, enjoy the story, and soak up the dialogue, both in the quests and in the voice acted cutscenes. The finish line will always be there, and the sooner you get there, the sooner you're waiting on the next expansion. But if you take the time to watch the cutscenes and read the quests, you'll end up screaming, "Oh my God," along with everyone else as some huge plot twist unfolds before you. I can say this as someone having experienced these moments dozens of times throughout my journey. Now, what if you're just not the type of person that cares about stories and lore? What if the community's praise wasn't enough to get you to slow down and enjoy the story? I know when it comes to story and quests and MMOs, some of you just can't be bothered. That's okay, because with or without understanding the story, the group content, the stuff that takes this from being any other Final Fantasy game and turns it into an MMO, is amazing. But fair warning, warning, there is going to be a lot of story content that you have to work your way through to get to that group content. So if you are the type of person that hates story content in MMOs and you don't think there's any way you're going to enjoy this story, it is going to be quite a bit of a grind for you to get through the story in Final Fantasy XIV. But speaking of group content, let's dive into that topic here. Group content is roughly broken into about 3 categories. You have your 4-player dungeons, you have your 8-player trials and raids, and then you have your 24-player raids. Despite Final Fantasy XIV having so many dungeons, it does a great job of keeping them varied, and that was the part that impressed me the most. The dungeons typically have 3 boss fights within, and they get more complex and interesting the farther along you get into the game. The final boss being an epic conclusion to the dungeon and the quest that brought you there. And upon slaying that final boss, you are greeted with an epic cutscene that seamlessly closes that mini story arc and begins the next. While the dungeons are solid, my favorite content is going to be the 8-player content, which often has you spawn standing directly in front of the boss that you're about to face off with. In the past, I've said that these are not just a boss fight, but an entire spectacle. The boss itself is epic, but it doesn't stop there. Each boss has its own incredible soundtrack. The bosses have multiple phases where not only does the boss change their appearance, but so does your entire stage that you're fighting on. There are multiple difficulty levels that you can choose from in this type of content, allowing you to take on more and more difficult versions of your favorite fights for more interesting prizes. On the flip side, if you're more of a casual player, you can take on the easier version, or what we'll call the story mode version of these, to see the show without some of the more punishing mechanics. Personally, this hard content is my favorite content in the game. As an MMO player that loves challenging group content, this game delivers a ton of it. Where a lot of modern MMOs drop the ball is the rewards at the end of the raid. You kill the final boss, and what do you get? In most MMOs, not much, as they've tucked all the cool stuff into the cash shop. You want a cool mount? It's in the cash shop. You want a really cool weapon? It's probably in the cash shop, but not in Final Fantasy XIV. In Final Fantasy XIV, it is the exact opposite. You can get everything you'd hope for. Amazing gear, amazing cosmetics, pets, and yes, epic mounts can all be earned in the game by killing those bosses at the end of these raids. Final Fantasy XIV also has 24-man raids, which are mostly for the story. They aren't very difficult, but they are fun and definitely epic, and you can get some cool stuff within. Again, they've got great soundtracks to accompany them. This content works more like traditional old school raids you think of from MMOs in the past, traversing a massive dungeon with a large group of players, killing monsters and bosses along the way until you reach the end and find yourself face to face with the final boss. These are also tied into the story of the game, just as everything is, including epic cutscenes that play out as you enter and exit the raid. So I suppose that's a lot of pros about group content. So I would say the biggest con of group content is that if you're the type of player that doesn't like having to move out of danger zones during a fight, you're going to have a hard time. If you stand still for too long in any Final Fantasy XIV fight, you're going to get got. There are always lots of damage zones on the floor that you're going to have to avoid. And yeah, that's a pretty weak con, I know, but I don't really have a lot of cons to throw at Final Fantasy XIV group content. Now on to PvP, which reminds me, if you like this game, you'll love Persona 3 Reload. This faithful follow-up to the Persona series is built with cutting-edge graphics. In this game, you'll explore the darker side of a real, modern world where the boundaries between the ordinary and the supernatural blur. And don't worry, the story of Persona 3 Reload is self-contained, so you can jump in even if you haven't played the previous titles. Dive into the haunting depths of the human psyche in Persona 3 Reload, where the provocative themes of mortality, fate, and the delicate balance between life and death intertwine. Immerse yourself in a thought-provoking narrative that explores the profound meaning of existence, challenging you to confront your own mortality and find solace in embracing the uncertain cards life deals you. You'll engage in intense, turn-based battles against menacing enemies, harnessing the unique strengths and weaknesses of your Persona party while you experience the ultimate fusion of role-playing and captivating visual storytelling. Use devastating combos to exploit enemy vulnerabilities and carefully strategize your party's actions to achieve victory in the face of ever-increasing challenges. Persona 3 Reload is available on Windows, Steam, Xbox, and PlayStation, so check it out now using the link in the description below. And thank you Sega for sponsoring and supporting this channel, and thank you guys for listening. Now let's get back to the video, and don't forget to check out Persona in the description below. Final Fantasy XIV does a decent job with PvP compared to most MMOs, but I definitely wouldn't say that it's the primary focus of the game. And as with most MMOs, whether you enjoy it or not will come largely down to whether or not you typically gravitate towards PvP in MMOs. So what type of PvP is there? You've got Crystalline Conflict, which is a 5v5 mode that was added fairly recently. It functions a lot like a push the cart map in Team Fortress 2 or Overwatch, with both sides battling it out and trying to push the crystal to their respective finish lines in order to win. Another mode is Frontline, which features 3 opposing teams of 24 players for a total of 72 players on the the battlefield. If you're looking for the large scale battles that only MMOs can provide, this is the one you want. Though I will say, if you're a PvP main looking for the strategic large scale encounters that MMOs can provide, ESO's castle sieges when they aren't lagging, and Guild War 2's world versus world battles might be a more compelling option until Ashes of Creation comes out in 15 years. Next, we have a mode known as Rival Wings, which is a 24v24 mode inspired by MOBAs, where NPCs and players fight side by side to battle over objectives on either side of a linear map. The PvP in Final Fantasy XIV is surprisingly active, and they are still constantly getting updates to the PvP content, as well as entirely new types of PvP content, which isn't something that many MMOs can say in 2024. A lot of MMO PvP communities are complaining about the fact that their MMO is not adding anything new for them to do, but Final Fantasy XIV's community doesn't have that problem. Next, we have combat. What's combat like? How does it feel? Final Fantasy XIV has what we call tap target combat. What does that mean? Well, when you select an enemy, your character will fire all abilities at that enemy, regardless of whether or not your screen is looking at that enemy. The alternative MMO combat style being known as action combat, which would require your crosshair on your screen to be on the enemy that you intend to attack. It's a pretty minor difference that ends up having a huge impact on the combat, particularly for support roles. The game does feature the trinity of tank, healer, and DPS. The job you choose will determine the role you fill. If you choose paladin, you're a tank. If you choose black mage, you're a DPS. If you choose blue mage, you're special. The 2024 Dawntrail expansion adds 3 new classes. The Viper will be a dual wield melee class, the Pictomancer will be a paintbrush wielding mage, and then the third job will be the Beastmaster, which will be a limited job similar to the blue mage. One of the coolest things about Final Fantasy XIV is that you will level all of your jobs on the same character, and in order to switch from one to the next, all you do is change your weapon. By putting on a black mage weapon, you become a black mage with all the black mage abilities and loadouts and gear and all of that good stuff. If you put on a white mage weapon, now you're a healer with all of your white mage abilities. Now, of course, the game does not let you switch roles while you're inside of a dungeon, but anytime you're not in some instance dungeon or combat, it's going to let you switch roles. This game features your old school low level experience, you know, the one where you start with like one skill, you select an enemy, and then you use your one ability to kill it, but then that quickly expands as you level up. You will unlock more abilities, more passives, as well as what the game calls class gauges. These class gauges act as a sort of mini game that you play in your rotation as you fight, creating windows where you do huge damage, pop your cooldowns, and fire off those big abilities. In its early levels, combat feels slow and simple, but this ends up serving to provide you a great sense of progression, as that will quickly change as you unlock abilities, passives, job gauges, and your off-global cooldown abilities known as OGCDs. These are abilities that you can press anytime as they're not affected by the global cooldown. All of this to say that while the combat might feel a little slow early on, I promise you it won't feel slow later when you're battling it out in a savage raid. Another thing I appreciated was that Square Enix does not hold back when it comes to ability and spell animations in combat. At one point, an artist asked Yoshi if he wanted a big animation, a beautiful animation, or flashy animation, and Yoshi obviously just said yes. So when you cast a spell in Final Fantasy, it feels satisfying. The sound, the animation, the artists were not lazy. The only downside is that some people might find it to cause a bit of visual clutter, but don't worry, if that's a problem for you, you can always go into the menu and turn down the animations. Next up, we have character customization. One of my favorite pastimes in any MMO is making my character look awesome, and this is one of those parts of the game where people are either like, yes, I love to hunt for the best mounts and cosmetics, and then others are like, I will put on a brown paper bag and never think twice about my character's appearance. If you fall into the first group, you'll love Final Fantasy XIV's deep customization. It starts off with a fairly straightforward character creation screen. Nothing mind-blowing here. It lets you choose from multiple races with tons of sliders that allow you to create your character that's unique to you. Where the character customization really shines is once you get into the game. You will constantly be finding gear that looks better or worse than what you're currently wearing. When you find a cool cosmetic, such as a weapon cosmetic, you can save its appearance in your dresser and apply it to any weapon you put on thereafter. The UI for all of this is still a little bit archaic feeling, but it's a heck of a lot better than it used to be, so it's serviceable. Final Fantasy has no problem with your character looking as cool or even ridiculous as you desire. It gives you a lot of freedom in deciding what you look like, and it provides a ton of avenues for you to go and earn these cosmetics in game. This is one area where Final Fantasy XIV really stands out from most other MMOs. You can earn the best cosmetics. You don't have to buy them, but we'll dive more into monetization later. But that's really important because, as the saying goes, fashion is endgame. Once you beat the dungeons and the raids, you farm the cosmetics so that your character can look awesome or ridiculous. A lot of other MMOs sell all the best cosmetics in the cash shop, and then this entire endgame experience of hunting down the coolest looking mounts and armor is a hollow husk of of what it's meant to be. Fortunately, Final Fantasy XIV is not guilty of this. You can see someone with a really cool weapon, and then you can go farm that really cool weapon, thereby causing your character to look legendary. It's such an important thing, and it's something I miss while I'm playing other MMOs. Speaking of mounts, yes, Final Fantasy XIV lets you farm the best mounts in the game by beating bosses and other various types of content in the game. Final Fantasy has one of the strongest mount games of any MMO, with hundreds of mounts players can earn in-game. And they aren't all just reskins of the same few mounts. There is real variety here, and I love that. In fact, the scope and the variety of mounts you can earn in this game might be better than any other MMO out there. It's truly impressive. Now for the population health. Everything I've said so far is great, but it doesn't matter if there's no one playing the game, right? So how is Final Fantasy XIV's population? Well, simply put, it's massive. It usually finds itself having around the second largest MMO population, sitting just between WoW in first place and old school RuneScape in third. We saw it briefly take first place during the peak of its Endwalker expansion, and we might see that happen again during Dawntrail. What do you think? The last but possibly most important thing to talk about with Final Fantasy XIV, it's monetization. The story is amazing, the group content is amazing, the Final Fantasy fan base is stronger than ever. This is usually when the devs start to crank up the monetization and drive their player base that they've worked so hard for away. So did the Final Fantasy XIV devs abuse that love and nostalgia for a franchise that has become so important to so many? Nope. In fact, I'm happy to report that Final Fantasy XIV is still perhaps the most consumer-friendly MMO I've played to date. The best cosmetics are earned in-game. The best gear is earned in-game. The best mounts, you guessed it, they're earned in-game. If you find yourself impatient and in need of cosmetics, this very second, the game does offer a cash shop, but you'll have to leave the game to browse it. That's right, the game doesn't pop up harassing you to purchase things while you're playing it, destroying your immersion. No, it hides the cash shop on their website. This is unheard of in 2024, but I love it. It's the truest, most unadulterated MMO experience I've had in a long time. My subscription gets me everything. I've said it before about Final Fantasy XIV, and I'll say it again. It's that very mentality of trying to make money by making a great game that more people want to play, instead of trying to extract money from the people that do play it, that has resulted in this game being massively successful and massively loved by its community. It's a breath of fresh air in a genre that's hamstrung with over monetization. So in summary, the solo content is some of the best, but it can be a bit heavy on the dialogue boxes that they want you to read. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a cinematic is worth 1,000,000. So it was a very welcome change when they started to replace these dialogue boxes with cinematics after the base game. There are a lot of MMOs in production right now, and I really hope they are taking note of the way Final Fantasy XIV weaves the solo and group content together seamlessly. Final Fantasy XIV has one of the most active group content communities in the world, despite being known for its single player story, because every bit of that story is constantly pushing you into the group content. Every player in Final Fantasy XIV is a dungeon runner, and every player is a raider. Every player has run dozens of raids by the time they hit max level. I've played other MMOs where players have hundreds of hours without a single raid attempt because that MMO does such a spectacularly horrible job of introducing players to that type of content. One quality of Final Fantasy XIV that's unique to it when I'm playing MMOs is that it's the only MMO where I have to go back just because I want to see what happens next in the story. Not for the gameplay, not for the dungeons, not for the raiding. I just want to know what happens next in the story. And even if every other part of this game was a letdown, which it's not, I would still be coming back for the story. That's how much I appreciate the story in this game. Final Fantasy XIV is how you write a story that leaves the players wanting to quest for the story rather than simply for the reward. There's a rather common opinion that the earlier quests are the slowest, with the story just continually getting better as you go along. And I totally agree with this sentiment. Not because the early story was bad, but it was slow, but because it was slow and it was building the foundation for much more exciting stories that would follow. So if you're playing through the early game and it feels like it's dragging, push forward. They've greatly truncated the base game so that players can get through it faster. Square Enix removed something like 1/5 of the quests in the base game and then shortened a lot of the ones that remained, so it should be a lot easier to get through it than before. Group content is amazing. The dungeons, the raids, the alliance raids, and even the deep dungeons, all of them are really well done. Dungeons tend to be a bit easy, but savage raiding will get your blood pumping if that's what you're after. And if you hate yourself, you can always try and tackle the ultimate raids. And if you're not familiar with those, that's where the developers torture the players that complain the rest of the game is too easy. As for the PvP, it's solid, but I haven't been blown away by it like I have by the PvE. PvP isn't the main part of the game, like say Arcade or Lineage. It's a mini game slapped onto the side of the MMO. Admittedly, I don't have a lot of time in Final Fantasy XIV PvE content, so maybe I'm underselling it, but the PvE content in this game has just always done a much better job of keeping my attention than the PvP content does. The combat in Final Fantasy XIV is great, and it really shines when you get out of your early levels and unlock your class gauge. Gameplay between classes feels genuinely different. Skill animation animations and limit breaks are just so beautifully made. There is so much effort put into them that you can't help but feel amazing while you're firing off your abilities in this game. The only downside for Final Fantasy XIV combat is that it might suffer a little bit from skill bloat. I think my Dark Knight has around 30 abilities that it has to have slotted at any one moment. Some of these are kind of redundant, so if they could remove some of these abilities and give them charges or something, I think that would help, but I'm sure the developers could come up with an even better solution if they put their minds to it. I'm an MMO veteran, so I happily deal with it, but I could see a lot of players being turned off by having 30 abilities on their bar at max level. But let me stress, I don't want them to oversimplify Final Fantasy XIV like other MMOs have done, where they only have a handful of abilities on the bar. I love that I have an ability for every type of situation and that I can strategically use them when needed. As for character customization, it's amazing. You have no trouble creating a character you're excited about logging into, and best of all, you don't have to touch the cash shop to get the coolest cosmetics in the game. And yes, that includes mounts. So there are so many earnable mounts. The monetization is the best of any MMO out right now. It's fair. They don't abuse you with loot box gambling. They don't hide the best cosmetics in the cash shop. They don't even put the cash shop in the game. You have to go out of the game to seek it out. And outside of the level boosts that they sell to help players catch up to the existing players, there's not an ounce of pay to win in this game. Still, I think it's dumb that they sell the level boost, because I don't know a single person that's used one and not quit the game immediately after using it, because jumping from low level to all of a sudden having 25 abilities that you don't know how to use in the middle of a story that you don't understand is just not a great experience for anybody. But outside of that, the monetization of this game is nearly perfect. And because of all of that, it's one of the biggest MMOs right now. A shining beacon, a perfect example of what happens when you focus on making a good game first so that more people want to keep playing it, instead of focusing on getting as much money out of the players that you have before they stop playing. Regardless of how much weight you give my opinion, you can play the first 70 levels and the first 2 expansions for free. So there's no reason not to jump in and decide for yourself, rather than letting some guy on YouTube tell you what to do. If you enjoyed this video, and if you're still here, hopefully you did, so please consider liking, subscribing, or commenting for the algorithm. I would greatly appreciate it, as it helps way more than you know. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Massive thank you to my YouTube channel members,
And a special shout out to Shane Boss for being the newest member of the channel.
To support my channel and become a member, click the join button below to find out about the perks like behind the scenes footage, private Discord channels, and more. And if you're not sure what to do next, check out one of the videos on screen right now. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next video.